I never thought I'd sit in front of a camera at the age of 90, with hands trembling and a heart heavier than it has ever been, to finally speak out loud what I've carried in silence for more than 70 years. If you're watching this, please listen with your heart. What I'm about to share is not fiction. It is the truth I buried deep within me, hoping that maybe time would erase it. But time doesn't erase horror. It buries it alive, until the day it finds a voice again. My name doesn't matter anymore. Who I was, who I pretended to be for so many years, those titles, those habits, that identity, it all fades now in the face of what I need to confess. I entered the convent in 1947, a young girl filled with faith, naive dreams, and a belief that the church was the safest place a woman could be. But I was wrong, so deeply wrong. The halls that smelled of incense and sanctity, the stained glass windows that bathed us in holy light, and the whispered prayers that echoed off ancient stone walls, they all masked something else, something darker, something not from God. And I saw it, I lived it, and I stayed quiet, not because I wanted to, but because I was made to, silenced by fear, by obedience, and by the belief that speaking would lead to eternal damnation. The guilt of silence is its own kind of torment. There are moments, even now, when I wake up gasping from dreams I never chose to have. Faces I haven't seen in decades come back to me. Voices whisper things I hoped I'd forget. But today, I will not push them away. Today, I will tell you what happened, what they never wanted anyone to hear, what they covered, what they erased, and what I regret not shouting from the rooftops. This is not just my story. It is the story of every girl who entered those walls believing in salvation and found something else entirely. Asterisk, I remember the first time I saw the convent gates, tall, iron, and unmovable, like the entrance to another world. I was just 17. My mother was crying, my father silent, and I, full of hope. I thought I was stepping into a life of purpose, devotion, and peace. The church had always been the pillar of my family's existence. Becoming a nun was not only an honor, it was a calling, or so I believed. The building stood atop a hill, surrounded by silence and mist. The air smelled of damp stone and old wood. As we walked toward the entrance, a woman in black robes opened the door, her eyes blank, her expression unreadable. She welcomed me without warmth, and I didn't question it. I thought that's just how holiness looked. Inside, the air was cold. The walls were lined with faded portraits of saints and past mothers superior, and everything felt heavier than it should. A quiet tension lived in every corner. I remembered the silence most of all. It wasn't peaceful, it was stifling. There were no birds chirping, no laughter, no footsteps beyond your own. As I was led to my room bare, with a single bed and crucifix on the wall, I felt the first twinge of something I couldn't name. Not fear, exactly, but unease. A sense that I had crossed a threshold into a place where different rules applied. The other girls were polite, but distant. Their eyes avoided mine. I assumed they were simply shy or deeply devoted. It never occurred to me that they were afraid. Not yet. But I would learn. Very soon. The first week inside the convent was like entering a different dimension, one where time moved slower, and everything felt watched. We were woken at 5 every morning by a bell so loud it echoed through your bones. There was no talking during meals, only the sound of spoons tapping against metal trays and distant hymns playing from unseen speakers. Every moment was scheduled: prayer, cleaning, study, more prayer, silence. At first, I thought this was discipline, structure. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The senior nuns, the ones who had been there for decades, had a look in their eyes that I would come to recognize all too well: emptiness, not peace, not fulfillment, just quiet despair, hidden behind polite smiles. There was a list of rules pinned to the dormitory wall. Most were expected: no speaking after lights out, no wandering outside designated areas, absolute obedience to the Mother Superior and to Father Augustin, the spiritual guide of the convent. But what disturbed me most were the unspoken rules, the way conversations stopped when certain nuns entered the room, the way everyone avoided one hallway near the chapel, and how, if someone broke a rule, they disappeared for a day or two. When they came back, they were changed, distant, quiet. Their eyes avoided contact. When I asked Sister Madeline what happened to them, she simply shook her head and whispered, "Don't ask questions, just do what you're told." I laughed, nervously, thinking she was being dramatic. But that night, I couldn't sleep. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. It didn't take long before I began to notice patterns, small, subtle things that most would overlook unless they were watching closely. Certain girls were often called out of bed late at night. They'd be summoned quietly by one of the senior sisters and led down that hallway, the one we were told never to enter. We called it the silent wing. It was always cold there, always dimly lit. No one was allowed near it without permission. The ones who went in never spoke of it afterward. I remember one night in particular. Sister Alina, who shared a bed near mine, was taken. She was young, only 16, always cheerful. When she came back 2 days later, she didn't speak, not one word. Her eyes were hollow. Her hands trembled when she tried to eat. I asked her what had happened. She just stared at me and whispered, "Don't ask. He's watching." That word hit me in a way I didn't expect. I asked who she meant, but she refused to say more. That was the first time I truly felt fear. Real fear. Not spiritual. Doubt, not guilt, but dread. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And the more I watched, the more I realized how many of us were living under that same invisible threat. Father Augustine, the man everyone revered, was always present. Too present. He smiled too often, touched shoulders a little too long, asked personal questions under the guise of confession, and no one questioned him. Not the sisters, not the church, not even the outside priests who occasionally visited. He was the untouchable symbol of authority, and somehow, we all felt his power without him having to raise his voice. We were trapped, and most of us didn't even know it yet. I began to feel it in my stomach, a constant knot, like something heavy was sitting just below my ribs. It wasn't hunger, it was fear. It came every time Father Augustine entered a room. He had a way of looking at you that made your skin crawl, even while he smiled. His sermons were always about purity, sacrifice, obedience. But his eyes told another story. There was a darkness behind them. And slowly, it became clear that some of the sisters feared him deeply, not because of his power over our souls, but because of what he could do behind closed doors. One afternoon, I was asked to clean the prayer room next to his private study. As I dusted the edges of the window, I heard muffled sobs coming from inside. I froze. I knew that voice. It was Sister Miriam, a kind, gentle girl, barely 17. I stood there, paralyzed, not knowing whether to knock or to run. But before I could decide, the door opened just slightly. I caught a glimpse of her face, red, swollen, terrified. Father Augustine stood behind her, adjusting his robe with no sense of urgency or shame. He looked at me, smiled, and simply said, "She's had a spiritual crisis. Nothing for you to worry about, child." Then he closed the door gently, as if nothing had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her face, her trembling hands, her silence. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that maybe it was just a bad moment, that I was reading into something that wasn't real. But the more I tried to forget, the louder the truth became. Deep inside me, I knew. I had seen the mask slip for a second, and what was underneath was not holy. It was monstrous, and it would only get worse from there. After that day, I started noticing everything. The glances, the whispered warnings, the strange disappearances that no one ever explained. The silence wasn't just fear, it was survival. The girls who spoke too much were sent away to other convents, or worse, punished in ways that left them different. Some stopped smiling, others wouldn't talk at all. We were told they were under spiritual discipline, but none of us believed that anymore. We were trapped in a sacred prison, where the very man meant to protect our souls used our obedience as a weapon, and no one dared speak his name in vain, not even the older nuns. One evening, after Vespers, Sister Ruth, one of the oldest and most respected among us, pulled me aside. Her hands trembled as she spoke, and her voice cracked with pain. "You need to be careful," she said. "He watches you." My heart sank. I asked her what she meant, but she only shook her head. "You're young and pretty. He has a taste for that. Keep your head down." That warning stayed with me. It didn't make me feel safer, it made me feel hunted. I began to shrink into myself, to avoid his gaze, to fake illness whenever I could, but it was never enough. The worst part was knowing we couldn't run. Our letters were censored, our visits monitored. The outside world had no idea. And if we did tell someone, who would believe us? We were nuns, holy women, Who would believe that the very priest who led our confessions was the one filling our lives with nightmares? The truth was unbearable, and the silence deadly. Every day I lived in fear that I'd be next. And one day, I was. One cold evening, during silent prayer in the chapel, I felt something that made my skin crawl. Father Augustine's eyes on me, not in the way a priest watches over his flock, but something else, something that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. I kept my head down, hands folded, trying to ignore the weight of his stare. But that night, for the first time, I was cold. A knock came to the dormitory door just after midnight. Sister Francesca, one of the elder nuns, entered with a candle in hand and said softly, "Come with me. Father Augustine wishes to speak with you." I felt my heart skip a beat. I asked why. She didn't answer, just turned and walked toward the corridor I had learned to fear at the silent wing. The hallway seemed longer than usual. Each step echoed against the stone floor, and the deeper we went, the more the air felt heavier, colder, almost damp. She stopped in front of a wooden door I had never seen before. Without a word, she knocked once and then disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone. The door opened slowly, revealing a small room with nothing but a single chair, a crucifix on the wall, and Father Augustine standing beside a desk. He smiled warmly, too warmly, and gestured for me to sit. He began with kind words complimenting my devotion, my discipline, how pure my spirit seemed. At first, I was flattered, nervous, but flattered, until he placed a hand on mine and didn't let go. His voice softened, but his eyes never blinked. He spoke of obedience, sacrifice, and the sacred connection between priest and sister. His hand moved up my arm. I froze. Every part of me wanted to run, to scream, but I stayed, because I was taught that priests were holy, that this, somehow, was part of God's plan, and that disobedience would mean punishment, or worse, eternal shame. That night marked the beginning of a nightmare I could never have imagined when I first stepped through the gates of that convent. After I returned to my bed, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were spinning, my stomach twisted. I kept replaying every word, every touch, trying to convince myself that maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I had imagined the fear, but deep down I knew, and worse, I knew I wasn't the first. Over the following weeks, I watched more closely. The same pattern kept happening. Girls being called in the night. Some cried when they returned. Some stopped speaking altogether. One of them, Sister Lucia, even tried to run away. They found her in the orchard, barefoot and bleeding. The next morning, she was gone. We were told she'd been transferred to another convent for her mental health, but we never heard from her again. I started to understand that Father Augustine's power wasn't just spiritual, it was absolute. He controlled what we saw, what we heard, what we believed. And most terrifying of all, he controlled what we feared. The church trusted him. The outside world admired him. Inside those walls, his word was law. And the silence was enforced by guilt, fear, and faith twisted into a weapon. I stopped looking him in the eye. I avoided being alone in the halls. I prayed constantly, not for salvation, but for invisibility. I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the stone like so many of the others had. I wasn't ready to speak, not then, but the weight of the truth was already carving itself into my soul, and one day it would demand to be told. I started to count the days, not in hope of leaving, because leaving wasn't an option, but in quiet desperation to survive without being called again. Every time a candle flickered near midnight, my breath caught in my throat. I pretended to be ill. I faked injury. I volunteered for the dirtiest chores just to avoid attention, but nothing worked. Once you were marked once, Father Augustine saw something in you. You belonged to him. The worst part wasn't even the nights I spent in that cold room. It was waking up the next morning and seeing the world pretend nothing happened. The nuns continued their prayers. The bells still rang, and Father Augustine still stood at the altar, speaking of purity, of heaven, of sacrifice. I wanted to scream every time he preached. I wanted to run to the village and tell someone, anyone. But how could I? Who would believe a 17-year-old nun accusing a respected priest? And I wasn't alone. Over time, I found quiet alliances, small looks exchanged between girls, broken whispers late at night, hands held under blankets while we cried silently in the dark. We were not weak, we were scared, and we were bound by the same invisible chain, silence. Sister Anna, who was just 15, clung to me one night and whispered, "I think he hurt my baby." My blood froze. I didn't understand at first, but then, I did, and I wanted to collapse. There were no doctors, no help, only shame, secrecy, and punishment. She was told too fast for purification. The next week, she was gone. I never saw her again, and I carried her words with me like a haunting echo. That's when I realized, this wasn't just about control. It was deeper, sicker, and we were completely alone inside that hell dressed as heaven. From that point on, I was no longer just afraid. I was furious, but it was the kind of fury you can't express, the kind that stays locked in your chest, screaming inside while you force a smile on your face. I started keeping track of every girl who vanished, every odd whisper, every cryptic instruction from the older sisters, and that's when I noticed something chilling. The older nuns, the ones who had been there for decades, were not blind. They knew. Some of them had been victims too, long before I arrived. Their silence wasn't ignorance, was survival. I saw it in the way they lowered their eyes when Father Augustine walked by, in the way they avoided speaking to us in private. They were like ghosts, moving through the convent, broken, numb, and bound by something darker than any vow. They had given up fighting, and I was starting to understand why, but I couldn't give up, not yet. There was one girl, Sister Camille, who refused to stay quiet. She was only a year older than me, but so much braver. She once confronted Father Augustine during morning confession. I didn't hear what she said, but the very next day she was gone. Not transferred. Gone. Her belongings disappeared. Her name scratched from the registry. The Mother Superior told us she had chosen to leave her calling. But we all knew that was a lie. That morning, when we gathered for prayer, I looked around at the empty space where Camille used to sit, and something broke inside me. I felt like I was mourning a death I couldn't speak of. And maybe I was. That's when I began writing things down, everything I saw, everything I heard. I hid the notes under a loose floorboard beneath my bed. I didn't know what I'd do with them. I just knew the truth had to be recorded. Because, if no one survived to speak it, then it would die with us. The notebook I kept became my secret companion, my only form of resistance. Every word I wrote felt like a cry in the dark, like carving truth into the walls of a prison cell. I documented the nights I was called, the names of the girls who vanished, the bruises I noticed, the blood I helped clean. I wrote down dates, patterns, prayers we were forced to repeat while barely able to stand. I even recorded the strange rituals Father Augustine would perform in private sessions, how he twisted scripture to justify his cruelty, how he whispered lies about obedience being the highest form of love. I wasn't writing for anyone in particular. I just needed to prove to myself that it was real, that I wasn't imagining the horror, that we weren't crazy, because that's what they tried to make us believe, that we were the sinners, the disobedient, the ones who deserved punishment. One night, I caught Sister Marionne 13 crying alone in the laundry cellar. She was shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak. I wrapped her in a blanket and held her for hours until the morning bell rang. She never told me what happened. She didn't need to. I already knew. But what shattered me was how normal it had become, how we had all accepted this pain as part of our daily life. The convent was no longer a place of prayer, it was a cage of silence. And the church, instead of being our refuge, had become our warden. Sometimes, we would hear rumors from the outside visitors who came during Sunday Mass, women from the village whispering about trouble at the convent, but no one ever acted. The church's image was too sacred to be questioned, and so, we were forgotten, hidden in plain sight. And every day that passed, I felt my faith not just weaken, but die. As the months turned into years, I began to realize that the damage we carried wasn't only physical, it was spiritual, emotional. It lived in our posture, in our prayers, in the way we flinched at sudden sounds. Many of us no longer prayed to feel closer to God. We prayed to be left alone. We prayed not to be noticed, not to be touched. I watched as once bright young women faded into shadows. Some lost their ability to speak, others forgot how to smile. We aged rapidly inside that place, as if the air itself drained the life from us. I saw girls break down in confession booths. I saw them collapse during morning mass. And every time, we were told it was a trial of faith, that we had to endure it, embrace it, offer it as a sacrifice. But deep down, we all knew, this wasn't a trial from God. It was a nightmare created by men hiding behind God's name. The church continued to praise Father Augustine. Letters of recognition were sent to the convent. Bishops visited and spoke of his unshakable commitment. We stood beside him for pictures, forced smiles beneath haunted eyes. I stood next to him once, trembling inside, while he placed his hand on my shoulder for the camera. I wanted to scream, but instead, I smiled, because, if I didn't, the consequences would come after dark. The silence, the disappearances, the punishments, they were our daily routine. But what hurt the most was that we started to turn on each other. Paranoia crept in. We didn't know who to trust. Some sisters were informants, hoping to gain favor. Others were simply too broken to help. We stopped sharing meals. We stopped whispering. We became islands inside the same stone walls, each of us carrying a secret too heavy to bear and too dangerous to speak. And yet, my notebook kept growing, because even if my voice was stolen, my words would remain. Somewhere, somehow, someone had to know. There was one moment, a single night, that changed everything for me. It was the night I nearly died. I hadn't been called for weeks, and I thought maybe I had finally been forgotten. Maybe they had moved on to someone else. But then, I found a note under my pillow. No name, no explanation, just 3 words: midnight, the cellar. My hands trembled as I read it. I knew what it meant, and something in me snapped. I couldn't do it again. I wouldn't. I didn't care if I was punished. I didn't care if they banished me, beat me, erased my name like they did to the others. I hid in the storage room instead, curled up behind a stack of crates. I stayed there for hours, holding my breath as footsteps echoed nearby. I heard voices, doors creaking, someone calling my name. I stayed completely still, and then I heard Father Augustine's voice. Calm, patient. You cannot run from obedience, he said. God sees disobedience, and he punishes it. I stayed, hidden until dawn. When I finally emerged, I expected chaos. But everything was normal. Breakfast was being served. Prayers had begun. No one mentioned the night. No one looked at me. But I could feel it. They knew I hadn't shown up. And someone, maybe even one of the sisters, had told him I was missing. That day, I was pulled from kitchen duty and assigned to scrub the courtyard stones with a toothbrush in the cold, without gloves, for hours. My fingers bled. My knees ached, but I didn't cry, because pain was nothing compared to what I had avoided. That night changed something inside me. I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. But I also knew I couldn't escape, not yet. I was watched, trapped, and still, I kept writing. The notebook became more than a diary. It became a record, a testimony. And I started hiding copies, pages smuggled into the lining of robes, behind broken bricks, inside hollowed-out books, because if I couldn't survive long enough to speak, maybe my words would. Eventually, the weight of my silence became more unbearable than my fear. And that's when I made a dangerous decision. I began secretly speaking with Sister Helena. She was one of the oldest nuns in the Convent Fraja, gray-haired, always quiet, but behind her tired eyes, I sensed a deep sadness and a deeper wisdom. One afternoon, as we tended the herb garden together in silence, she suddenly whispered, "I know what you've seen." I froze. My heart pounded. I didn't answer. She didn't ask for details. She just said, "You are not the first. And you will not be the last." It was the first time someone older acknowledged what was happening. I felt tears welling in my eyes, but I swallowed them. She told me, in that trembling voice, that long before I arrived, others had tried to expose the truth, but the church was powerful, and the silence ran too deep. "Still," she said, "if one of us makes it out, tell everything." That became my mission, not just to survive, but to make sure the truth didn't die in the shadows. I shared my notebook with her. Slowly, page by page, she read it, sometimes weeping, sometimes praying over it. And then she did something I didn't expect. She added her own memories, her own horrors, her own names. I realized then that this wasn't just my story. It was a collection of voices suffocated for decades. Sister Helena told me about a hidden passage beneath the chapel floor. A small tunnel, long sealed, used by nuns during times of war to hide from invaders. She believed it still existed and that it might be our only way to smuggle the journal out to someone who could read it. A local woman came weekly to clean the chapel and refill candles. She was our chance, our messenger, but passing her the journal would be a risk that could cost us everything. Still, I was ready. We both were. because even if we couldn't escape those walls physically, our truth could that we believed might one day save others. The day we decided to pass the journal was overcast. The sky looked like stone cold and unmoving, mirroring the weight in my chest. I wrapped the pages in linen, tied them with a ribbon that once belonged to Sister Camille, and slipped the bundle into a hollowed-out hymnal we had carefully prepared. Sister Helena whispered one last prayer over it, pressing the cross from her rosary into the cover. We both knew this might be our last act of defiance. If we were caught, there would be no forgiveness, not from the church, not from Father Augustine, not even from some of the sisters who had chosen blind obedience as their only way to cope. When the cleaning woman arrived, a quiet lady from the nearby village named Clary waited near the altar, pretending to polish the gold trim as she worked. She always brought fresh candles, sometimes flowers. She never spoke much, but this time, as she bent down to gather the old wax, I placed the hymnal carefully into her basket and whispered, "For your daughter. It's a gift." She looked at me for only a second. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, just nodded once, quickly, and continued with her task. My heart pounded the rest of the day. Every creak in the floor made me jump. Every call from the elder nuns felt like a summons to judgment. That night, I barely slept. Sister Helena held my hand in the dormitory, her grip weak but steady. Morning came, then the next. No reaction, no punishment, no missing girls. It was as if nothing had happened. But I didn't believe that. I knew better. Somewhere out there, Clara had read the journal, or maybe she hadn't. Maybe she had burned it in fear, or worse, delivered it to someone who would return it to Father Augustine. Every sound outside the convent now felt like a threat. Every visit from church officials made my blood run cold. We had done something irreversible. We had broken the silence, and now all we could do was wait. Weeks passed, and still no response. No confrontation, no punishment. The silence felt heavier than ever, because now it carried anticipation. I couldn't tell if we had succeeded or if we were simply being watched, our punishment quietly prepared. Sister Helena tried to reassure me, but I could see her age weighing on her more with each passing day. The fear was consuming her from within. And then, one morning during chapel, something unexpected happened. A man entered the sanctuary alone, unannounced. He wore no priest's collar, no robes, just a long gray coat and tired eyes that scanned the room slowly. He didn't speak, he didn't kneel. He just sat in the last pew and watched. I recognized him immediately. He was Clara's husband. I'd seen him once through the iron gate when she arrived on a Sunday afternoon. But what was he doing here? After Mass ended, he remained seated. I lingered near the altar, pretending to clean, my heart racing. He glanced toward me once, just once, and then quietly slipped a folded note beneath one of the pews. Then he stood, tipped his hat to no one in particular, and left without a word. I waited until the chapel emptied, and with shaking hands, retrieved the note. It was short, barely a sentence, written in small, hurried handwriting. "We read it. We believe you. Help is coming." I almost collapsed. My knees gave way, and tears filled my eyes. After years of silence, of being told we were insane, sinful, delusional, someone believed us. Someone outside those cursed walls knew the truth. I ran back to the dormitory and showed Sister Helena. She smiled for the first time in weeks. But behind her smile, I saw something else: relief, yes, but also urgency. She knew, as I did, that the danger had only just begun, because if Father Augustine even suspected what we had done, he wouldn't wait for help to arrive. He would destroy us before it ever reached the gate. That very night, everything changed. A storm rolled in violent winds, flashes of lightning tearing across the sky, thunder that rattled the chapel windows. It was as if heaven itself had awakened. But inside the convent, something far more terrifying was brewing. During evening prayer, the bell rang 3 times, sharp, urgent, unnatural. The senior sisters immediately ordered us to our rooms, something that had never happened before. Doors were locked, candles were extinguished, the hallways went silent. I sat in the dark with my back against the cold stone wall, clutching Sister Helena's rosary in my hand. She was across the room, eyes closed, mouthing words I couldn't hear. We both knew, he knew. Sometime after midnight, footsteps echoed in the corridor, slow, deliberate. Then came the knock, 3 soft taps on our door. I froze. Sister Helena stood first. I tried to stop her, but she gave me a look that still haunts me, a mix of strength and goodbye. She opened the door and stepped outside. The hallway was too dark to see who was waiting, but I heard the voice, FatherAugustin.com, polite, like always. He asked her to follow him. That was the last time I saw her alive. The next morning, her bed was empty. Her name removed from the roster. No explanation, no ceremony, just absence. And I knew he had taken her because of me, because of what we did, because we spoke the truth. The pain of that loss was unlike anything I'd ever known. She had given me courage, she had given me hope. And now she was gone, and I was alone, again. But this time, something was different. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was furious. And that fury burned brighter than my fear ever had. Father Augustin thought he had silenced us. But he hadn't. Because her story lived inside me, her words, her strengths, her memory, and if help was truly coming, I would make sure the truth survived long enough to be heard, even if it cost me everything. The next days were suffocating. Every corner of the convent felt like it was holding its breath. Father Augustin didn't speak of Sister Helena. He didn't have to. Her absence was a message, a warning, and yet he continued with his homilies, his confessions, his private meetings, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The air was heavier, the sisters walked slower, eyes darted more, and I, though broken by grief, was no longer hiding. Something inside me had shifted. Sister Helena's sacrifice had lit a fire in me, so I began to act, quietly, carefully. I found other girls who had once whispered to me in fear, and I looked them in the eye and said, "He took her." Not everyone responded, but some did, and in their silence, I saw it, the same fury, the same ache. We started leaving signs for one another. A ribbon tied to a doorknob meant "Stay away tonight." A folded corner of a prayer book meant "We meet after supper." The truth was spreading now, not just in my notes, but in hearts. And for the first time, I realized how many of us there were. Sister Rosa had bruises. Sister Margot hadn't spoken in 2 weeks. Sister Alina, who hadn't smiled in over a year, finally looked me in the eye and whispered, "I want to fight." We were no longer isolated islands. We were forming a tide, quiet, strong, and rising. Then, on the third night after Sister Helena vanished, the gates to the convent opened. Unexpectedly, a black car entered. Not the bishops, not the churches, no insignias, just a man in a gray coat and a woman beside him with a notebook. My heart stopped. They were not clergy. They were not from the convent. And when they entered the chapel, I felt it. The walls were about to break. Someone had heard us. Someone had believed. And someone, finally, had come. The 2 outsiders introduced themselves as investigators from a secular human rights organization, one that had received an anonymous journal documenting abuses within religious institutions. They didn't say it outright, but I knew it was our journal. Clara had done it. She had delivered our voices to the world beyond those walls. And now, these people were here not as pilgrims, not as clergy, but as witnesses. I watched Father Augustin's face as they spoke to the Mother Superior. He forced a smile, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He knew the house of cards was trembling. He tried to charm them, of course, offered tea, spoke of the convent's noble mission. But the woman, her name was Lydia, wasn't fooled. She looked around at us, the sisters, one by one, as if searching for something unspoken. And when her eyes met mine, I didn't look away. That evening, while the guests were given rooms in the guest wing, Lydia found me alone in the garden. She didn't ask me anything. She just sat beside me on the stone bench and waited. And I broke. I told her everything. My hands trembled, my throat burned. But I let it pour out, years of silence unraveling in hushed sentences. She didn't interrupt. She didn't look shocked. She simply nodded and took my hand when I could no longer speak. "We've seen this before," she said, "and we won't let it happen again." The following morning, a van arrived at the gates. Plain, white, no markings. Inside were counselors, lawyers, 2 women in medical uniforms, and an interpreter. We were told it was a routine wellness check, but we knew better. The silence shattered. Girls began to cry. Others ran to embrace the newcomers. Some still hid in fear, but it had begun. The reckoning. Whispers of escape became open conversations. Secrets became testimonies. And for the first time in years, I saw something in the eyes of the sisters that had long been missing. Hope. We were no longer trapped, we were no longer alone. And Father Augustine, his days of power were numbered. The moment the truth began spilling into the open, the convent was no longer the same. The stone corridors that once echoed with whispered prayers and silent cries now buzzed with quiet conversations behind closed doors, real conversations. The investigators divided us into small groups, ensuring that every sister was heard in private, without fear of punishment. Some of the older nuns refused to speak at all. Others denied everything, too afraid or too loyal to the man who had ruled over us for decades. But many, like me, opened our wounds and let the truth out. Some told stories worse than mine. Some had scars I had never seen, on their arms, their souls, their faith. And every word was documented. Every tear mattered. Father Augustine's presence grew erratic. He no longer held his head high during Mass. He avoided the sisters, locked himself away. He must have known the walls were closing in. The Mother Superior tried to maintain the image of serenity, but even her mask began to crack. She begged us not to shame the Church, claiming that our suffering was a test of holiness. But we were done being tested. We were done being used. One morning, I woke to find his quarters had been sealed. The door bolted, guards placed outside, not from the Church, but from the authorities the investigators had called in. That day, we weren't led in prayer. We weren't told to scrub floors or recite verses. Instead, we were told to write everything, and so we did. By nightfall, dozens of written accounts had been gathered. Mine, Helena's, even Sister Anna's, whom I thought was lost, had her words submitted through someone from the village. Her story had reached them too. The notebook had grown beyond its pages. It had become a chorus of voices, an unbroken chain of women who refused to be buried in silence. And as I stood in the chapel that evening, with Lydia beside me, and my sisters no longer afraid to meet my eyes, I realized something sacred. The truth, once spoken, cannot be taken back. It can burn through stone. It can unmake monsters. It can save lives. It wasn't immediate. Change never is. But in the days that followed, the walls of the convent began to feel less like a prison and more like a place where healing could begin. For the first time in over 70 years, I walked the same stone paths I had once feared. But now, with the weight of truth behind every step, Father Augustine was removed from the premises under quiet but firm supervision. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He only glanced back once at me. And in that moment, I wasn't the scared girl from 1947. I was the woman who had survived him, who had outlived his secrets, who had watched him lose the control he once used to destroy others. As word spread, other convents ones we'd never heard from began reaching out. Stories from across the country surfaced. Other survivors, other hidden journals, other names. What we had done, it had opened something, a door, a floodgate. For so long, we believed we were isolated, unique in our pain. But we weren't. We were part of a pattern, one that was finally being brought into the light. I stayed in the convent a few more weeks, helping the younger sisters understand what came next. Some chose to leave, others stayed to rebuild. I didn't try to influence them, I just shared my story. And for many, that was the first time they had ever seen someone confront horror with truth and survive. Eventually, I left too, not in shame, but in peace. I carried with me the pages of my notebook, the memory of Sister Helena's last prayer, and the names of every woman whose voice was once stolen. And now, decades later, I sit here 90 years old with a microphone in front of me and a camera capturing this moment. I have nothing left to lose, and everything left to honor. This isn't just my confession. It's our collective scream, buried for generations, but never erased, because truth has a heartbeat, and even after 73 years, mine still echoes.